How was the RAAF led during the air battles over Port Moresby? We look at leadership in number 75 Squadron.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to episode 115 of the Principles of War podcast. This episode, 75 Squadron Leadership in New Guinea, looks at a couple of the COs of the squadron. What were their leadership styles and how did the tactical and strategic factors inhibit their ability to lead? At this point of the story, John Jackson has taken command of number 75 Squadron. He did that on the 19th of March. But let's have a look at the kind of person that John Jackson was. So he had been flying since 1934, and he was a member of the RAAF Citizens Air Force. In 1937, he bought a Beechcraft Stagger Wing, a biplane which had better performance than many of the aircraft in the RAAF. He married Elizabeth Thompson in 1938 and they had 2 children. He was called up for active service in the RAAF in October 1939. He had 3 brothers. Arthur was a civilian pilot and he was just 20 and about to join the RAAF in 1939 when he was killed in a flying accident. His other 2 brothers, Les and Edward, joined the RAAF in November 1939, 1 month after John had. John flew with number 3 Squadron in North Africa. There he flew the Gloucester Gladiator. This was a biplane with a cruise speed of 180 knots. His Beechcraft Stagger Wing had a cruise speed of 176 knots, so it was only a little bit faster. However, the Gladiator was a lot bigger and it had an engine that was twice as powerful. But it shows the fact that the Air Force at this point still had not modernised its equipment. He didn't have a lot of luck with the Gladiator, but after converting to Hawker Hurricanes, he became a lot more effective. One interesting side note here, there were 14,487 Hawker Hurricanes produced between 1937 and 1944. 20 times more than the 747 Gladiators that had been produced. This is interesting because the Hurricane had already been in production for 2 years before the war, but it highlights what industrial warfare looks like for an Air Force. Fighter production would evolve to include 20,000 Spitfires and 15,600 Mustangs. On the 18th of February 1941, John Jackson's shot down 3 Junkers Ju-87s in a single flight near Mersa Matruh, and he downed another one on the 5th of April. Number 3 Squadron then converted to the P-40 Tomahawk, and he became an ace on the 25th of June after destroying a Potez 630 light bomber. He was promoted to Flight Lieutenant on the 1st of July 1941, and by this stage he was flying with his younger brother Ed, who had joined Number 3 Squadron in Palestine. He was mentioned in dispatches and returned to Australia in 1941, and he was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his marked keenness and determination during operations in the Middle East with Number 3 Squadron. As for what kind of pilot John was, here is an assessment by Wing Commander Peter Jeffrey. He had been the CO of Number 3 Squadron and was the first CO of Number 75 Squadron. This is part of an interview with Peter by Edward Stokes for the Australian War Memorial.
John didn't have very much experience when he joined us because he was in the first big fight at Saloom, and when he came back he didn't even know what a reflector sight was all about, and he shouldn't have been in fighters because he's a bit old. If anything, to me, he was inclined to press on too hard and not wait to fight another day. But as far as his guts was concerned, when I was getting 75 Squadron together, John tackled me and he said, I'm entitled to the command of this squadron. He said, I've got more experience than anybody else has here. And he said, I've been through it. And I said, John, look, I'd sent you back from the Middle East. I thought you'd done your business and you were a bit operationally fatigued and you shouldn't be here at all anyhow. And he turned on me and he said, what in the bloody hell are you doing? You're fighting for king and country or something. I've got a wife and kids back there in Australia, and no Jap bastard's going to get anywhere near them except over my dead body. And I gave John the squadron, but I had a feeling at the time that he would press on too far. And on his first operation, I warned him, I said, for God's sake, don't go backwards and forwards on that strafing run, because you haven't got any idea whether they've got top cover or where they are, what's happening. Just hit and get away, and we'll find out what happens from there on. Which, of course, John didn't do. He went back 2 or 3 times, and they did a lot of damage, but he got some of his pilots caught and shot down too. And that would be his only fault as far as I'm concerned. But he had extraordinary courage.
Peter Jeffrey brings up some interesting points. Jackson would have been 32 years old when he joined No. 3 Squadron, and indeed his nickname was Old John, and yet he was still able to down 5 enemy aircraft. Peter Jeffrey also mentions issues with his hearing and his eyesight. However, he was still a great pilot. Wing Commander Jeffrey is also one of the few officers tracking combat fatigue with pilots in their squadrons. Jackson had been posted to a flying school on his return to Australia, and this would have been the perfect posting for him. He would have had some time to decompress whilst passing on his combat skills. But he hated it, and he was very keen to be posted back into an operational squadron. Combat fatigue, the stress of being in combat, the psychological damage that can occur, this is something that we've talked about previously, and it's also something that we're going to return to when we look at Les Jackson. That little excerpt also highlights the dire strategic situation with which Australia finds itself and the strain that puts on our soldiers, sailors and airmen. The threat to Jackson's family was very real in his mind. He wasn't to know what the limits of the Japanese strategy were, but it gave him something very clear and tangible that he was fighting for. That fear of invasion was real for Jackson, and indeed it was real for many people from the Prime Minister John Curtin down. Jeffrey also mentioned something very interesting in that excerpt, and that is the fact that Jackson had come to the squadron without a lot of combat skills. Wing Commander Jeffrey has got a little bit more to say about the Empire Air Training Scheme and the requirement for an operational training unit. He starts out by describing the skills that the replacement pilots have when they join No. 3 Squadron.
Yes, John Jackson and the first replacements came actually while we still had the Gladiators, but they were still all officers, and we didn't get the NCO aircrew until we started the Syrian campaign. But basically the replacements we got at that stage had no operational training in a operational training school. Some of them had come from squadrons, but they'd had very little time in the squadrons, and most of them had only flown a Wirraway anyhow as an aircraft, and so they had to be converted in the squadron. And when you're in the middle of combat, it's very difficult to get time to convert these people properly. And so if they had 5 hours flying, they were lucky in a lot of cases. And some of the replacements, particularly when we went back into the desert, some of the replacements were coming virtually from SFTS, from the Service Flying Training School, and this was criminal. And the RAF got a fighter OTU going in the desert, but it wasn't until Nicky Barr and the people that came with him, and they were the first people that went through the OTU there.
Right, so there was a kind of interregnum when you were getting men who really had no OTU experience at all.
No, none whatsoever.
The Empire Air Training Scheme, of course, was the source of a lot of these pilots. Aside from the fact that there was this lack at certain points, at least, of operational training, but thinking now of their basic training in the EATS, how good was that training?
Well, that's hard to say. It was just the fact that some of these people just unfortunately didn't have the amount of hours and whatnot to give them the experience that was needed for the job. I don't know of any of them that didn't face up and went, didn't face up to combat, that went brave and didn't fight well within their limitations. And they certainly did that, but we took too many casualties amongst those people, which was one reason why I was anxious to get the OTU going when I got back to Australia.
In another excerpt, Edward Stokes asks a very important question about the Empire Air Training Scheme.
Just vis-a-vis the Empire Air Training Scheme, Peter, I think you're suggesting that it did rather dilute the command strength of the Air Force, in your opinion.
Well, the Empire Air Training Scheme was a fantastic thing in that it turned out an enormous amount of pilots, and overall they were well trained. But from my point of view, I think that the RAAF suffered as a result of it, because instead of getting officers overseas from Australia into combat positions and getting combat experience, the whole of the RAAF was virtually turned into a training command. And when I came back from the Middle East, I believed very definitely that they had a training command attitude and that they didn't have any conception of the urgency of getting on and doing things and cutting your red tape and your administration and everything to the absolute minimum.
That's most interesting. And just to put that in context, that was in context of some of the difficulties, I think, of 75 Squadron getting established and effectively into New Guinea.
Yes, well, the whole conception of forming 3 squadrons from 75 aircraft showed a complete lack of appreciation of what your losses are going to be going into a place like Moresby with the Jap and experienced Jap pilots at the other side. And in fact, they were almost wanting to pull 75 Squadron back out of Moresby about 3 days after it got there, because their aircraft serviceability had got down to virtually nothing. And if they'd done that, the Army would have swum ashore.
You can hear the frustration in Wing Commander Jeffrey's voice there. The RAAF doesn't have enough aircraft, it doesn't have enough trained pilots, and it doesn't have enough time to train pilots properly. He also hints to the fact that there isn't enough infrastructure to be able to maintain the squadrons. This makes the role of leading No. 75 Squadron all the more difficult. On the 10th of April, Jackson left early for a solitary reconnaissance mission over Lae Airfield. After flying over the field at very low altitude, he headed out to sea. The Japanese had been waiting and 3 Zeros took off as soon as he had flown overhead. The Kitty Hawk, at low altitude, could normally outrun the Zero, but not on that day. Potentially a lack of maintenance for the engine, which was serviced in very primitive conditions, precluded Jackson getting all of the usual speed that he needed. As the Zeros slowly gained on him, he turned to face them, hoping the superior firepower of the Kitty Hawk would dissuade them. However, his guns jammed. They met at high speed, and Jackson's aircraft was shattered, and he managed to ditch the aircraft 3/4 of a mile off the beach. Once he exited the aircraft, he waited to see if the Japanese flying overhead would strafe his aircraft. They lost interest and returned to base. As he started swimming to shore, he saw a log, which, on closer inspection, turned out to be a crocodile. Luckily, it wasn't interested in Jackson, and he was able to make his way to the beach. A group of natives appeared fearful of his arrival on the beach, and it was only 2 young lads who were willing to assist him. They had spent time at the Duke of York missionary station off Rabaul. One, Edmund, was Church of England, and the other, Arthur, was a Methodist. They alone were willing to assist Jackson. The proximity of the Japanese at Lae and the risk of reprisals for helping a downed flyer dissuaded the rest. This group would assist the Japanese as they attempted to track Jackson down. Here we see the importance of shaping activities in Phase Zero operations as a part of a whole-of-nation strategy. And this is an enduring strategy. It was the Methodists who had established a mission in New Britain in 1877. It wasn't easy, with missionaries being killed and eaten by cannibals, and the Reverend George Brown led a punitive raid to secure the mission in what became the Blanche Bay Affair. But that enduring presence had spread a cultural affinity that was the only thing that ensured Jackson would have the help that he needed on that beach just up the coast from Lae. Back at Moresby, the squadron became worried, and at 0930, after the time when his fuel would have run out, he was posted missing. A Japanese air raid needed to be fought off at 10 a.m, which impeded search operations, which found nothing. The Japanese had sent 2 boats for search for Jackson from Lae. Once they landed, they were led up the track that Jackson and his 2 guides had taken. Jackson, like Wilbur Wackett, had removed his boots in the water so that he could swim, and now his feet were paying the penalty. They quickly became extremely painful to walk on. Jackson and his guides would make their way slowly to Wau. He would see flights overhead, some of them from No. 75 Squadron, as they continued to attack Lae. On the 17th of April, he saw a section of Kitty Hawks that was surprised by Zeros. One was shot down. This was Squadron Leader Barney Creswell, the new CO of No. 76 Squadron, and he had joined No. 75 Squadron to gain some operational experience. He had been a regular RAAF pilot with 8 years of flying experience, but this had been his first combat flight. Squadron Leader Creswell did not survive the crash. When he reached the village of Marpos, he was given some tea and some Australian sunshine condensed milk. More importantly, there was word that a New Guinea Volunteer Rifles patrol was in the area. Jackson scribbled a note for them about his plight. 2 days later, Sergeant Stuart Fraser and Rifleman George Kerr entered the village. Looking at Jackson's feet, they decided to organise for him to be stretchered out to Wau. From Wau, Jackson was able to get a message back to 7 Mile Drome. The mission to retrieve their CO was thwarted by bad weather, but the next day they were able to land at Wau. That was the 23rd of April. 1 Kitty Hawk would escort a Dauntless dive bomber and deliver supplies and return with Jackson. He was given a quick briefing on how to use the Dauntless's rear-mounted twin 30 cal Browning machine guns. As they returned to 7 Mile, Lieutenant Schwab, the pilot of the Dauntless, buzzed the airfield. This was a mistake. The strip had just been raided and 3 Zeros were still in the area. Spotting a lone Dauntless, they attacked. John Piper in his Kitty Hawk saw the Zeros too late. A 20mm shell hit the Dauntless aircraft that Jackson was in, and the top of his finger was sliced off. The Dauntless went on to divert to 3 Mile Strip, and Jackson was finally home. He described his adventure as such to his wife in a letter. Yesterday had a hot reception. Was about to land when 3 Japanese made a surprise attack. Aircraft I was in got shot full of holes. Had tip of finger grazed. Just a mere scratch. Providence surely guided and protected me all through. Tons and tons of love, sweetheart, to yourself, Patricia and Arthur. From your ever-loving husband, John. Jackson would be back in the air on the 28th of April, just 5 days after returning to 7 Mile. One of the big questions is why he was returning to combat so soon after such an ordeal. This is an important question because it had dire consequences for Jackson and for the squadron. Some of the events that happened around this time have been lost to the mists of time, but it appears to have something to do with a brief visit from the outgoing Chief of the Air Staff, Sir Charles Burnett. He spoke to the 2 RAAF commanders in Port Moresby, Wing Commanders Gibson and Pearce. Soon after Jackson's return to Port Moresby, he was summoned by these wing commanders for a meeting. Here is an excerpt from an interview with Flight Lieutenant Arthur Tucker that was done by the Australian War Memorial in 1989. I'll let him describe the events.
That Pearce was one of the 2 wing commanders at Moresby during the period that we're talking about, Gibson and Pearce. And they called John F. Jackson in to, no doubt, to discuss with him what had happened in the period when he'd been coming back over the Kokoda Trail. John F. called us together in the mess, and he said, now things have got to change. He said the wing commanders, naming them, are of the opinion that you are not pressing the enemy, you're not engaging them, you're not getting close to them. He said, you're not dogfighting them. Whereupon the 1 or 2 howls, but you know we can't dogfight them. You told us not to. John F. said, "Tomorrow I'm going to show you how." Well, he did. He was killed, and his very good friend Barry Cox was killed. Various other aircraft were injured. Now, that man would never have got himself and his colleagues into that position because that was exactly what he'd told us not to do, and it's the only reason any of us survived.
Could I just clarify a few points? This is, I think, a most interesting, important episode. First of all, I understand the general expression dingoes was used as describing...
Dingoes was the word they used.
The wing commanders.
Yeah.
Right. Secondly, let's just turn back to Jackson's general views about fighting Zeros, and I understand that was that one was that you simply couldn't dogfight because you couldn't beat the capabilities of the Zero.
You couldn't turn with them. That's absolutely true. But you could do this bunt. You see, you were not escaping when you bunted. I've told you that the aircraft had this peculiar, meaning special, ability to fly upside down or in negative G without the motor coughing, and therefore the defensive manoeuvre was immediately to bunt whenever you saw evidence of attack, which were like flaming cricket balls going past your head. That was the tracer. You bunted, the Zero's engine cut out, you gained speed, and then you came back and had another go. And that was the only thing you could do. I must say, too, along with this bunting, that the war diary written by Colley has made the air reports of air combat of 75 Squadron absolute laughable nonsense, because he's always talking about stalling and spinning. Now, he didn't understand what pilots were telling him when they would tell him they put everything in one corner, or got the hell out of it, or they dived out. And he always put stall or spin because he obviously knew nothing about flying. And there was one circumstance under which in combat a Kitty Hawk would stall, and that was that if you were chasing an aircraft at altitude or the Zero was zooming up from you and you lost speed and you fired your guns, the moment you fired your guns, a 1 second burst would knock about 60 mile an hour off your speed, in which case the Kitty Hawk would flip. But that was all right too, because you could recover in a downward direction and then gain speed again. But you see, the technicalities of this are completely corrupted any reports I've seen of air fighting at that period.
That's most interesting, Arthur. Just turning back finally to this episode with Jackson and his exhortation to people to, in fact, do precisely what he always recommended them not to do. Are you sure it was the next day that he was himself shot down?
Yeah.
Right, okay.
He said, "Come up tomorrow and I'll show you how." Everyone said, "You can't do it. You said yourself." He said, "Tomorrow I'll show you," and he was killed.
Tragically, it appears that there had been little intelligence gathered about Japanese capabilities and tactics. Claire Chenault from the AVG, the American Volunteer Group, or the Flying Tigers, had already been working on this problem. The AVG had had their first air combat on the 20th of December 1941, just 12 days after Pearl Harbor. They were fighting the Japanese in China. Chenault had developed a different approach to combat based on his intelligence about the Japanese tactics and the capabilities of their aircraft. This was matched with his observation of the tactics used by Soviet pilots in China during the Soviet-Japanese border conflicts in 1939, where there was a large amount of air combat, and his assessment of the strengths and weaknesses of his own aircraft and pilots. Like the RAAF, Chenault had many AVG pilots with little experience, and some quit at the first opportunity. Chenault and his Flying Tigers benefited from the country's early warning network, which was called the best air raid warning system in existence. Starting from areas in Free China in hundreds of villages, stretching from near Canton through all of Free China to the capital in Chongqing, far northwest, was a network of early warning stations equipped with radios and telephones that gave early warning of incoming Japanese aircraft. The RAAF didn't have a network of this sophistication, and the distances between Lae and Port Moresby were quite short. It would be months before radar stations were operational to augment the early warning for the planes at Port Moresby. This early warning was critical because it enabled the planes the time they required to gain altitude. Ideally, they would be higher than their attackers so that they could convert altitude to airspeed. When Japanese aircraft attacked, Chenault's doctrine called for the pilots to work together from an altitude advantage, since their aircraft were not as manoeuvrable or as numerous as the Japanese fighters they would encounter. They flew the P-40B Warhawk, an earlier model of the P-40E Kitty Hawk the RAAF had. He prohibited his pilots from engaging in turning combat with the Japanese fighters, which were more agile, instead instructing them to conduct slashing attacks and to dive away to set up for another attack. These dive and zoom techniques were contrary to US Army Air Force tactics, but they'd been used successfully by Soviet units serving with the Chinese Air Force. The RAAF was slow to develop specific Zero versus Kitty Hawk tactics, and those that were developed at the squadron level were not, as we have seen, supported by senior RAAF officers. And so ended the life of squadron leader John Jackson. To get an understanding of the impact that had on the squadron, let's return to Flight Lieutenant Arthur Tucker.
He was the only bright spot of it, and I would say that had John F. Jackson not existed, the squadron would not have been effective in that defence role for as long as it was. He was the one who, there was a tactic, and the tactic was that you climbed up, you tried to stay together, you had a squirt at something, and if it looked as though they got on your tail, you bunted, that was put everything in one corner, dived away to get up speed, and then come back and have another go. That on no account were you to try to dogfight the Zero, because that was not on. And that you just kept on doing that while you could, and that was it. Now, when he was shot down in the period before he was recovered, and then when he was killed for the period to the end of it, there just wasn't any contribution other than that. So the whole spirit of John F.'s leadership, and I suppose his final sacrifice, was the thing that made 75 Squadron. He was a magnificent fellow, middle 30s, ex-estate agent, and he's that sort of wonderful, solid Australian countryman that we all like to think most Australians are, but few ever reach that sort of stature, quite unlike any of his colleagues.
What was the effect on the squadron then of his going missing and during the period until he returned?
Well, as soon as they found out he was all right, that we heard he'd been recovered, well, things went on much the same, but his death devastated everyone.
John Jackson was killed on the 28th of April. He'd been leading a flight of 5 Kitty Hawks, which were responding to yet another bombing raid on the airstrip. As usual for raids on Port Moresby, there was insufficient warning time to climb above the attackers. 8 Betty bombers and somewhere between 11 and 15 Zeros as escorts made up the attacking force. The squadron was fighting outnumbered 4-1, but that was not unusual. As the Kitty Hawks reached 18,000 feet, they met the Bettys, which had already attacked the airfield. Peter Masters fired at a Betty, and the recoil from his guns caused his aircraft to stall. Cocky Brereton was wounded, forcing him to retire. Jackson engaged the fighter escorts with Barry Cox. A dogfight ensued, a dogfight that both pilots would lose. One of the two managed to hit a Zero, which was forced to ditch into the Huon Gulf, but the 2 Kitty Hawks never had a chance dogfighting against Zeros with such experienced pilots. One crashed into Mount Laws, and the other crashed into Waigani Swamp. When the 2 planes didn't return, Bill Dean Butcher, the squadron doctor, informed Les Jackson, who was in hospital recovering from gastro. Les Jackson insisted on coming with him to the crash sites. They couldn't get to the swamp, so headed to Mount Laws. They met a truck with soldiers who had been to the crash site. The crash had been at such a high speed that the engine was forced 6 feet into the ground and the 8-foot wing was compressed to just 8 inches. All they could recover was a foot inside a size 12 boot. Barry Cox was a short man and John was quite tall. It was John's boot. Les and the squadron doctor returned to 7 Mile Drome and 75 Squadron, which Les took command of again. John had been killed following the orders of the wing commanders that he knew made no sense and would cause further casualties. He was buried the next day at a funeral with just 4 attendees: Bill Dean Butcher, Les Jackson, and wing commanders Pearce and Gibson. On that sombre note, we will leave the episode here. Next week, we will return to look at the final days of the squadron in Port Moresby, the leadership style of Les Jackson, and the operational lessons for the employment of the Air Force within the New Guinea theatre. Remember, if you got something out of today's episode, please like and share it if you see it on social media. More importantly, spread the word about the PME resources that we've got on the Principles of War.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.